Well, thanks for joining us, everyone. It's great to see you here. Before we get started, I want to do our land recognition. Nuckutuck wishes to honor the indigenous communities native to the chapter area, including the Pagusset, Wepawag, Quinnipiac, Tataket, Nuckutuck, and Hammonasset people. As we advocate for conservation of the land and its wildlife, we're indebted to the work of Native and Indigenous people who cherished the land for thousands of years before European colonization. I don't think Pat needs any introduction. He's been with us many times, and I recognize a lot of names of people that know him well. So without further ado, Pat, you can share your screen.
Okay.
Start your presentation.
If I can get this rolling.
Perfect.
Okay. Does that look good, Dennis?
Yes, it does.
Title screen. Okay. Thanks very much for inviting me. I sort of backed into being a geologist in the course of writing the books I've done. And let's see. So I was particularly concerned when I started this field guide series to try to address the what of field guides and environments, not just the why actually, and not just the what. So not just a catalog of what you might see in a particular environment, but how things got to where they are. And that kind of backed me into looking at the environmental history of Connecticut and other places. And of course, the geology there, because it's been so influential. So I want to say up front, I'm not a geologist. I don't play one on TV, but I have absorbed a lot of geology on the way to some of the other projects, the book projects. So I've only got an hour and we have 500 million years to cover. So I'm going to march quickly through particularly a lot of the bedrock stuff. Connecticut's bedrock geology is very complicated. If you want to drill down into it, this really, it's hardly a book. It's more like a fat pamphlet, but the state publishes it. The Geologic History of Connecticut's Bedrock is excellent as a quick overview on, as I said, about 500 million years of how all the bedrock geology got here. I'm going to mostly concentrate on the Ice Age because that really covers most of what you're going to see unless you're very particularly attuned to geology, and mostly coastal systems because frankly that's mostly what I know, and things that affect our local wildlife. If you are at all interested in Connecticut geology and geography, I'd highly recommend Michael Bell's book, The Face of Connecticut. It's just a superb introduction, not just to the geology, but the geography and the human history and the environments of Connecticut. It was published by the state about 25 years ago. Unfortunately, it's long out of print. Amazon usually has used copies. I checked this afternoon and they don't happen to have any now, but I'd highly recommend this if you want to know the kind of background behind all the birds and plants and wildflowers and things that we normally. So believe it or not, this is a pretty simplified version of Connecticut geology. It's very complex. All that swirling paisley stuff came from multiple continent-sized collisions along the way in Connecticut's history, particularly the formation and then breakup of Pangaea, but other things as well. So I'm going to try to give you a quick bash on Connecticut rocks. It's a very dramatic history that goes back probably about 300 million years that I'll cover here very quickly. But as you can see from this very famous Z-fold, these are ocean bottom rocks that were metamorphosed into schist and then crunched when pretty famous rock formation because it's so dramatic, and you can actually see it, hopefully if you're not driving, on Route 9 in Higganum. It was exposed in a road cut, so you get to see a little bit of the drama here. It's hard to explain how we got to where we are without talking a little bit about plate tectonics. Plate tectonics is very new. In fact, when I was an undergraduate in the early 1970s, geology professors were still teaching plate tectonics as a new kind of interesting but scary thing that just came along. It's that young. The science is only about 50 years old. Although the guy who came up with it, Alfred Wegener, first proposed the theory of continental movement back in 1911. Nobody believed him, and it sat on the shelf for a long time. But in the 50s and 60s, there was accumulating evidence from geomagnetism studies and other things that showed that Wegener was indeed right. As every school kid has noticed, South America seems oddly to fit into Africa and stuff. And that's because continental plates move around. Big convection currents in the mantle drive these processes. They go slowly. For example, the Atlantic Ocean's getting wider by about an inch a year. But if you take that inch and multiply it by 50 million, then you start getting real movement, albeit slow movement. So these are the modern crustal plates. And there's still a lot of movement, particularly in the so-called ring of fire around the Pacific Ocean and all the volcanoes and earthquakes they have, et cetera. Our particular area has been geologically quiet for about 100 million years. It's what geologists call a trailing coast. All the drama has moved away from us, thankfully, and now occurs mostly in the mid-ocean ridge and the Atlantic. But before that, we had quite a dramatic history. So continents move around. 300 million years ago, they were scarcely recognizable. Some of the main continents, or at least the core, the rocky core of them, are still recognizable. This so-called Laurentia was the proto-North America, named for the Laurentian area in Canada. And those rocks are about 1 billion years old. So the core of the continents persist a long time. And I'm showing you this because of this ancient ocean. This is not the Atlantic or anything close to it. This was called the Iapetos Ocean, IAPTOS. That had formed really most of the bedrock of Connecticut, these ancient strata on the ocean bottom that were metamorphosed into rock, now schist, as geologists call it. And there was this ancient island chain called Avalonia, which was out in between the Iapetos and the Rheic Ocean, way back when, 300 million years ago. And I've zoomed in on the details here so you can't see it, but Africa and South America and the northern part of Europe and a bit of Siberia were all about to collide and essentially squeeze the Iapetos Ocean out of existence and shoved it up against Laurentia. And that's where Connecticut came from. 100 million years later, the red star is the Connecticut area. It would have been absolutely unrecognizable. As you can see, it was Connecticut area was quite a ways inland. You could walk to Morocco if you wanted to. There was no Atlantic Ocean. This predates the Atlantic Ocean. And the black line here is the equator. So when you say go to Dinosaur State Park in Rocky Hill and look at the dinosaurs and things, you should not imagine that it was like going to Rocky Hill, but with dinosaurs. The landscape landscape would have been almost unrecognizable that surrounded the dinosaur, but for some very persistent features that I'll talk about in a few minutes. So this is a much simplified version of the bedrock geology of Connecticut right now. There are a couple of major features here. That ancient island chain of Avalon or Avalonia now forms most of the eastern part of the shoreline of the state. Lots and lots of granite there, including the famous Stony Creek granite. Most of the state is actually composed of various schists and granites and other things that were derived from that ancient Iapetus Ocean seabed that got crunched up against Laurentia, the proto-North American plate. And there are a couple of other important features to point out here. This red line, Cameron's Fault Line, that was more or less the original shoreline of Laurentia, later to become North America. So all of this other stuff in Connecticut in the eastern part, the Iapetus terrains, the Avalonian terrains, all that got crunched up against North America. And there are some interesting features here to point out from a wildlife point of view. This blue area here is very interesting. That's all limestone. It's very, very ancient, like 400 million years, something like that. And it's unique in the state in that that limestone area has lots of interesting different plants and ferns and other kinds of things that you don't see in the rest of the state, which has much more acidic soil. So I'm not going to go into the details. Whoops, keeps changing slides on me spontaneously. I'm not going to go into a lot of the details here because if Connecticut's complex, this is just geometrically more complex. Lots of earlier crunching from way back, Gondwana land formation and breakup, et cetera. So, but it's interesting from a biological point of view because of that underlying limestone makes a very different kind of soil than the rest of the state. The other major feature that you see here that I'll talk more about in a few minutes is our Central Valley, the Central Valley of New England, sometimes called the Connecticut Central Valley, but it's much larger than just Connecticut. It goes all the way up to New Hampshire and Vermont. And very importantly, it was not formed by the Connecticut River. This is not a river valley. The other thing that I will talk about a bit are these trap rock ridges. Here, the Metacomet Ridge that runs all the way up, East Rock, West Rock, Sleeping Giant, et cetera. They are all basalt or so-called trap rock ridges that are important geologically and biologically. So when you look at all that stuff, you don't get a sense of the terrain here, but Connecticut is sort of corrugated. What was 900 mile width of ocean bottom in the Iapetus Ocean and in Avalonia got crunched down to about 100 miles wide. And in that crunching and all the dramatic folding, we ended up with a more or less north-south corrugated landscape. And what do I mean by that? Think about driving on the Merritt Parkway from Greenwich to New Haven. And what do you see all along the way? You go up over hills, down into dales, up over hills, down, up and down dozens of times in even that short drive. And those are those corrugations. It's the part of the leftover of that crunching together that formed the area that eventually became Connecticut. And these are important not only for these north-south lines that run across the landscape were very important for early colonial settlement of the region. They are also important even earlier than that and still today for natural flyways that occur along these major rivers. Our major rivers run more or less north-south, but for some important deviations. And that's because of this corrugated north-south landscape. So in that, the ancient bedrock is still with us in ways you can see even in natural history. As I said, our Central Valley of New England is not a river valley. It's a valley that has a river in it, or several rivers actually. It's a rift valley. And most of you have probably heard of the East African Rift Valley. A rift valley forms when, and I'll show a closer view here, when the crust is pulled in different directions, and our rift valley is essentially a giant tension crack in the earth. Connecticut was crunched up against Laurentia, later to become North America, about 200 million years. That crunching formed Pangaea, giant supercontinent of all the continents together. And then it began to break up. And that pulling apart, where Africa and Europe and South America began pulling away from North America at that point, there was tremendous tension cracking in the earth. And our Central Valley is a rift valley. It's a giant tension crack in the earth where faults formed on either side of the valley, and the free block in the middle dropped down, almost as if, say, if you took a sheet cake and you grabbed both ends of it and you pulled it apart, you'd see cracking, tension cracking in the surface of the cake. And our Central Valley is a giant tension crack. As I say, these faults develop from tension cracking, and then the piece in the middle drops down below. So this is the Rift Valley, the most famous valley now. Rift Valley in this particular section is in Ethiopia. Notice the very steep, very high sides of it. And this valley is only about 25 million years old. Our Rift Valley in Connecticut and New England is more like 200 million years old. So it's very, very much older, very, very much eroded, and it's also wider because it has had a much longer history. Africa's Rift Valley is still forming, still spreading apart. But when we talk about brownstone, when we talk about other things in the Central Valley of Connecticut, all of that came from 100 million years of eroding sides of the Rift Valley in Connecticut. And there are multiple Rift Valleys in our landscape. The Connecticut Rift Valley is one, or the Central New England. This is not a name that geologists like very much because it suggests that the valley was formed by the Connecticut River, and it wasn't. The Newark Basin, the Gettysburg Basin, all of these are brownstone areas where all the brownstone building material came from. And they're all giant tension cracks. And it's not just three. Offshore of New England, there are half dozen more. The deeper areas of the Gulf of Maine, maybe the origins of the Great South Channel right off Cape Cod, et cetera, are all additional rift valleys from that tension cracking that happened as Europe and Africa pulled away from North America in the breakup of Pangaea. So this is our Central Valley, dropped down well below the surrounding hillsides on either side. And since it's very, very old, it's about 100 million years old, a lot of things have happened to it since the formation of the basic valley. As that tension cracking was happening, there was also a lot of volcanic activity in our area. And it did not form volcanoes like Vesuvius or Mount St. Helens or something. You shouldn't picture conical structures spewing lava from the top. These were a different kind of volcano that produces a very, very liquid magma that eventually became basalt. And it spread out across the valley floor. It must have been absolutely devastating. So no cones were built, but huge areas of the valley floor at various times were covered completely with these massive lava flows. There were also big blobs of lava in the interior of what is mostly brownstone, sandstone, that fills this valley. Again, the sandstone comes from 100 million years of erosion off the sides of the valley. They periodically were inundated with this basalt lava, and then more erosion covered up those sheets of lava. And as I said, 200 million years ago, you can see these marvelous murals that William Sillen did for the Dinosaur State Park in Rocky Hill. You can see the rugged sides of the Rift Valley, dinosaurs, et cetera. It looks tropical because it was tropical. We were much closer to the equator then. Continents don't just crunch together, they slide across the face of the earth. So this was very tropical. And if you know anything about tropical soils, they're called lateritic soils. They're this bright bricky red, which is the color of our brownstone. So again, here was a very, very different sort of place, but nevertheless was the same Rift Valley we see today with dinosaurs. So these trap rock ridges are very important, not only for the geology of the state, but also because they're very high and very dry, they are a very different kind of environment that draw in things that we might not have otherwise. Just to explain where our basalt ridges came from, things like East Rock, West Rock, et cetera. These are the beds of brownstone here, and filling the valley. This would be a cross section through a part of the valley. And in addition to these sheets of lava on the surface and the vents that fed the lava into them, there were large blobs of magma within the brownstone matrix. Now, brownstone is very much softer than basalt, diabase basalt, which when the magma cooled down, that's what geologists call it. And over 100 million years, it has eroded very significantly. The softer brownstone has worn away, and it left us these big ancient magma blobs that we call East Rock, West Rock, Sleeping Giant, et cetera, and the Hanging Hills of Meriden, the Metacomet Ridge. This is a cross section of the Connecticut Valley, or the Central Valley of New England, that might be sort of conceptually just north of or around the Hartford area. Connecticut River down on the bottom. It runs through the valley, but it didn't create the valley. And you'll notice that these brownstone beds and the trap rock lava flows are all tilted because of this eastern border fault. For about 100 million years, this fault formed when the Rift Valley formed, and it's been slipping down ever since. And so all of these areas tilt toward the east. And you can see that even today in the landscape when you look at the details of these trap rock ridges. Here you can actually see the tilt. This is the Route 10 connector in Hamden that connects I-91 and Whitney Avenue, Route 10. They cut right through a brownstone hill, but you can see that slant in the landscape, even in the brownstones in this road cut down toward the east. And it is brownstone. It's the same brownstone that Brooklyn and Manhattan and many other urban areas were built with. It's very easy to shape because it's relatively soft, but durable enough to use as a building material. So that's where the brownstone comes from. And these trap rock ridges turn out to be, as I said, biologically very interesting because they're very different than the sort of matrix of other environments around them. If you had told me when I first started birding in Connecticut in the early to mid 1970s that ravens would be, a common thing we see in the neighborhood, I would have been amazed. Back then, if you wanted to see a raven in Connecticut, you had to go in the wintertime up to the northwest corner of the state, and maybe if it was the right phase of the moon or Jupiter was aligned with Mars or something, you could see ravens, maybe. And now they're fairly common. It's a wonderful thing. I live about a mile from Sleeping Giant, and it's very rare that I go there that I don't hear ravens. As I said, these trap rock ridges, that ought to look very familiar to them if you know our landscape. Picture this, for example, as a cross section through the West Rock Ridge, where it drops off very sharply in a sharp cliff toward the reservoirs down here in the Bethany the area. And then on the eastern slope, it's very much more moderate. Say, if you were hiking out of the Lake Wintergreen area up to the top of the ridge, this is very much what you might see. And it's a fairly unique blend of things here. You see, for example, well, you see these red cedars on the ledges all the time, all over West Rock, East Rock, Sleeping Giant, et cetera, because they're well adapted to these very dry, exposed areas. Lots more prickly pear cactus than you might see other places. Post oak is something that's classic for trap rock ridges because although it's mostly a southern tree, it is fairly well adapted to dealing with the heat and dryness of these trap rock areas. So a unique environment. And here we have a photo of West Rock showing that classic profile, very sharp drop off to the west, gentle slope on the eastern side. And again, if you had told me, say in the 1970s, that we would not only have breeding peregrines, but multiple breeding peregrines within the city of New Haven, I would have been staggered. In the 70s, all birds of prey were doing really poorly. And now we have, the peregrines perfectly adapted to these cliff environments that the basalt ridges form. And so it's just wonderful to be wandering around like East Rock Park, very urban, and you look up and there's a peregrine, nesting peregrine. So after all that drama for about 100 million years, all the drama moved off basically to the east of us as the Atlantic Ocean continued to spread, as the volcanic activity and ocean floor creation moved hundreds and then thousands of miles away from us. Little Connecticut and the New England area, actually the whole East Coast became what geologists call a trailing edge coast, that is geologically quiet. That's opposed to, say, a coast like our West Coast, which is geologically very, very active, whole strings of volcanoes, et cetera, because the Pacific Ocean plates are being subducted underneath North American plate. And so you have lots of volcanic activity. It was very quiet for almost 100 million years here after all that drama in the breakup of Pangaea. And then the ice came along. It's hard to say exactly how many ice ages there have been, but if you want to drive a geologist crazy, talk about the ice age, because geologists know that there have been many, many, many ice ages, that is glacial periods. And the ice age we talk about in common parlance is really just the most recent one, the Wisconsin glacial episode, which peaked about 25,000 years ago and covered much of North America at its peak. It's conceptually, it may be easier to think of these glacial episodes as like gigantic extensions of the Arctic ice cap that came all the way down, not just to northern parts of Canada, but all the way down to Long Island and parts of the Midwest, et cetera. In the Connecticut area, say, roughly 45 million years ago, 40 million years ago, there was no Long Island Sound. And because the sea level happened to be at that time very much lower than it is today, we weren't even near the coast. I've put in the modern cities, of course, just for orientation in the landscape, but the coast was quite a ways further away. And there was no Long Island Sound. There may have been larger lakes in this ancient river valley, but much of it was dry. And Long Island, there's this myth that Long Island was created by the glaciers. It really wasn't. It was already a fairly high ridge of Cretaceous and earlier sandstones and brownstones and whatnot. What the glaciers created is the modern surface of Long Island and thickened it a lot, but it didn't create the fundamental basis of Long Island. And 25,000 years ago, it all got covered up. by the glacier. Again, I've put the major cities in here just for reference, but where we are today in the roughly New Haven, say Guilford, Brantford area, we would have been under about 5,000 feet of ice here at maximum extension. And if you could get up onto the surface of the ice, you would see ice and nothing but ice to all the horizons. It would have looked like central Greenland today. And that was only 25,000 years ago. I mean, it just staggers me. Remember that for the ages of the bedrocks in Connecticut, we're talking at least 500 million years old. So from a geological point of view, 25,000 years ago was the blink of an eye. And although it's very, very long compared to a human lifespan, 25,000 years ago isn't even out of the realm of human culture, because when Altamira and places like that were already being created back then. So it's not that distant a time, especially when you consider how astoundingly different it was. This is a larger regional view. The modern outlines are in red just for orientation. Long Island, the coast of Connecticut here, out toward Buzzards Bay and Cape Cod, et cetera. You're not seeing the ocean because there was so much water, the Earth's water bound up in this giant ice cap, that the sea was 400 feet lower. The sea level is 400 feet lower than it is today. So what's now all continental shelf was dry land back then. And it formed a kind of biological refugium, geographers call it. That is, all of the stuff that used to live up here, the plants, the animals, et cetera, had moved south. It was a very much colder environment than today. It probably would be more like central Canada today in terms of its exact environmental makeup. But the other thing you can see here is something that seabirders know all about, and fishermen, is these ancient rivers ran out onto the more or less, the ancestor of the Hudson River and some of the other major rivers. And that's where the canyons in the today's continental shelf come from, like the Hudson Canyon. It's very famous for pelagic birding and for the great fishing there. They're famous because deep sea animals will come very much closer to the shoreline in these canyon areas than they would in other places. And slide over and look at this. George's Bank was not a bank. It was a giant, almost a subcontinent out, sticking out into the Atlantic. Later, as the sea level rose, it became George's Island. And then probably about 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, it was finally inundated and became George's Bank. Just again, for orientation, here's Provincetown and the outer arc of the Cape. The South Channel lobe was deepened by a giant ice lobe there. South Channel you may have heard about if you're into either seabirding or whaling, because it's a very deep channel that occurs just to the east of Cape Cod, running in between Cape Cod and what's now George's Bank. So when you think about glacial ice, it's nothing like the ice cubes in your refrigerator. This is, my wife and I did a interesting series of hikes up above the tree line a few years back on Mount Rainier. And these are glaciers up on Mount Rainier, and you can hardly tell. The glaciers are so full of rock and dirt and salt and sand and silt that very often it's hard to tell what's glacier and what's native rock. For example, this is all ice all the way through here, even the darker parts of it. The rough margin of the ice is right along here in the lower right corner, but even there, it was hard to tell what was ice and what was not because of breakup of the ice and the glacier around the edges. But so these are like a gigantic nightmare sandpaper across the surface of the earth. They just crunch everything before them, and they're so powerful they can turn car-sized rocks into dust in just a few decades from all that grinding. So glaciers are not like ice cubes, and they have an enormous impact on the landscape. And one of the things they did was they robbed us entirely of our continental margin, the nice gentle margin that you see from New Jersey south that supports the gigantic salt marshes and other things they have. Basically, the glaciers left us, especially in Connecticut, with rock. And there's very much more exposed. In fact, there's no bedrock exposed in Long Island. It's all glacial till that was sort of bulldozed out across what's now Long Island Sound and then dumped in what's now the Long Island area. There was so much melting about 18,000, 19,000 years ago that so much water running off the landscape of New England that Glacial Lake Connecticut formed. It filled more or less the space that Long Island fills now, but that was it was a glacial lake, and it was all mostly frozen over for a lot of the year. But nevertheless, all that melting filled up the valley entirely with what were probably giant icebergs and very, very cold water, but fresh water. And then gradually that drained away. No, people imagine sort of Niagaras as these things drained away. It was, the geologists say, probably much more prosaic, that over hundreds of years, Glacial Lake Connecticut just drained away out of the Block Channel. There's still that deep channel between Montauk and Block Island, and that's where it drained out into the ocean. You're starting to see the coastline now because the sea is rising at this point. And it's a little, the dates are very approximate here for an interesting reason. So all the ice is melting and the sea level is rising, but the ice was so heavy on the landscape that the bedrock is actually springing up because it's been released from the weight of all that ice. And so you had this sort of contest between the rising sea and the rising land. So nobody's quite sure exactly what the dates are here, but eventually the sea begins to flood this valley that later became Long Island Sound. So, but Glacial Lake Connecticut was probably not even the most significant phenomenon, certainly in terms of human history from all that glacial melting. Glacial Lake Hitchcock was a giant lake that extended from the Rocky Hill area. If you know where that big tournament golf course is, it was that golf course was built on the remains of this earthen dam that blocked up the Connecticut and most of the drainage from New England and formed a gigantic lake that extended from Rocky Hill all the way up into the middle of Vermont and New Hampshire. And it persisted for a long time, probably thousands of years. People go back and forth about how long exactly it persisted. But like all lakes, it had very rich layers of sediment on the bottom. Eventually, after a few thousand years, the Connecticut broke through in several places. There was a spillway in the New Britain area, and then gradually broke through this earthen dam in right where the Connecticut runs today, past Rocky Hill, and this giant lake drained away. But what it left behind was something completely unique in the New England landscape, which is very, very deep, very, very rich soils that were not full of rocks. So you've heard about the rocky soils of New England and how miserable it is to farm them. Well, it always puzzled me. You'd see these early coastal sediments in like, Plymouth and Boston and parts of Cape Cod, and then along the Connecticut shoreline. And then suddenly there's large settlements springing up in places like Hartford and Springfield, all the way up through what's now called the Pioneer Valley Massachusetts. And that's because people discovered these incredibly rich lake bottom sediments were perfect for farming. So lots of areas were settled in this ancient Lake Hitchcock area well before the rest of New England was settled. And even today, this is a view from Sugarloaf Mountain. Which overlooks they call it the Pioneer Valley now, this valley. And you can see it's dead flat. And even today, it's very, very rich farmland, all from that ancient glacial lake. So, as I said before, the glaciers scoured the landscape so much that they essentially took away our coastal plain. Think about the very, very different sort of landscapes you see when you go, say, from New York City south along the Jersey Shore, the Delmarva Peninsula, Virginia, the Outer Banks, then especially below the Outer Banks down into the southern shoreline, gigantic salt marshes, for example, that go on as far as the eye can see because they're sitting on that coastal plain. We don't have a coastal plain anymore. Was dumped on top of Long Island, but most of it went away, and I'll explain why it is. But we have no coastal plain. All we have is rocks. So rocks aren't so bad. We had many still have excellent natural harbors because of our shoreline. What we don't have a lot of is sand and sediment. And so, say Sandy Point and New Haven Harbor, still a wonderful wildlife area, very important for migrants. Not a lot of sand there. This is typical. Look at the beaches back over here in the eastern part of New Haven. Tiny, rocky, crummy beaches. If there's a good beach, say in Connecticut, like say Rocky Neck or Hammonasset or places like that, those are nourished beaches. They're artificial. That's not our sand there. Our sand all went to the bottom of Long Island Sound. And it's going to stay there for a long time because although we have all these wonderful natural harbors and other things, we don't have a lot of sand and sediment. And that's really important for things like whether or not, and the size of whether or not we have salt marshes. One gift of the glaciers that's turned out to be extremely important for wildlife are all these islands that are left over. These are broken parts of glacial moraines and leftover bits of glacial till. And our mainland shores are so heavily developed that it's just pathetic. I think, maybe 3-5%, depending on how you calculate it, of Connecticut shoreline is natural environment, probably even less than that now. So all the things that used to nest on the shore have been completely displaced, except for these offshore islands. As I said, the glaciers just scour the landscape, and these giant moraines that I'm going to talk about come from the fact that think of the glacier as a giant conveyor belt. Now, here where the glacier has stopped is where the rate of advance of the glaciers flow forward is exactly equal to the rate at which the glacier is melting. But even though it may be static for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years in more or less the same place, it doesn't mean that nothing is happening because of that conveyor belt aspect of glaciers. It keeps dumping and dumping and dumping along the same line of melting. And that's what creates these giant moraines across the landscape. The terminal moraine for the glaciers in our area is called the Ronkonkoma moraine. And you can think of that as more or less the modern backbone of at least the surface of Long Island. So it created Montauk Point and all the highland areas on Long Island. Glaciers started melting back after about 25,000 years. A few thousand years later, the environment cooled again for whatever reason, and for hundreds, maybe 1,000 years, the end of the glaciers were here along the Roanoke Point Harbor Hill Moraine, and that's what created Orient Point, and very importantly, things like Plum Island and Great Gull Island and Fisher's Island, et cetera. These giant moraines across the landscape, you can still see at a glance today, and biologically, they're enormously important. And as the ice melted back, occasionally it would stall for some hundreds of years and create other smaller moraines. Whoops, don't do that. Like some of the moraines that are fairly famous today because of the islands. A lot of these moraines run along the bottom, what's now the bottom of Long Island Sound, but the Norwalk Islands, the Captain Islands, Faulkner Island off Hammonasset, and in fact, the Meigs Point moraine are all recessional moraines, as they're called, that as the ice was moving back, for whatever reason, happened to stall for a while and created a moraine. And these moraines run right across New England. The same moraines that created Montauk Point also created Block Island and the highland areas of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. And the later recessional moraines created much of the western Rhode Island shoreline plus Cape Cod. Geographers think of these sandy, piney areas that that run from, you know, P-Town all the way across to well, at least was the better part of Long Island before it got so heavily developed. Lots of sand in the environment, lots of things like pitch pines and other things that are very well adapted to sandy environments, which, because of the severe drainage, even though they get lots of rain and whatnot, the sand won't hold water. And so you get a lot of dry adapted plants here. And this is more or less the environment that I covered in my field guide to Cape Cod. I called it Cape Cod because, you know, Cape Cod's famous, but in fact, it's all the same environment. All the way through here, the outer lands environment, which doesn't really touch Connecticut at all, except for maybe around the Barn Island area. But very, very important biologically, and another gift of the glaciers, essentially. As I said, these regional islands that were derived from these regional moraines are really important. Plum Island is just a gem. That's why people are fighting so hard to save that from development, because it's such a spectacular natural history opportunity. Gardner's Island has been in the same family for 400 years. You can't go and visit there unless, you know, they invite you. But it's incredible wildlife environments. And of course, Great Gull is the largest tern colony, I think, in the country, certainly along the Atlantic coast. And so a lot of these areas are really important. Unfortunately, Fisher's Island is so heavily developed that although it has some nice environments around it, isn't as much of a factor. But nevertheless, these were sort of the gift of the glaciers in the environment, these islands. As I said, when you look at Long Island and you say, okay, there was all this runoff when the glaciers melted, there must have been a lot of sand and silt and lots of different stuff. Where did it all go? How come we have essentially no beaches or tiny, miserable beaches compared to what you see further south? And that's because all the sand is there. It's at the bottom of Long Island Sound. And because of the breakwater effect of Long Island, it ain't going anywhere. It's just going to sit there until, I don't know, sea level rise or whatever begins to mobilize it. You don't see that sort of effect in the ocean facing parts of Long Island or Cape Cod or Martha's Vineyard, et cetera, because of wave action. That tremendous energy moves sediments around. Because we're blocked by Long Island, all those sediments that ran off Connecticut and New England and might have made giant beaches, might have helped restore our continental margin, all are at the bottom of the Sound now. The Sound, especially for its size, is remarkably shallow. Its average depth is only about 62 feet. And that's sort of misleading because There are much deeper parts closer to Long Island. The Sound is very shallow, but the valley that it sits in was very, very much deeper, but it's mostly filled with sediments now. These river delta sediments or runoff rivers that spread huge deltas of lighter material, sand and silt, smaller rocks, gravel, out into Long Island Sound, but that's not available to us and our beaches. But we did get some good stuff from the moraine islands. For example, these glacial till islands are really important for wildlife. These happen to be the Norlock Islands. You can see what the core of the island was built up from, this mixed glacial till. The beach is very rocky because the edges have been scoured away. Same thing with Faulkner Island, shrinking practically by the minute. I took this photo from a plane in 1982. The island's very much smaller at a glance than it was back then. But these beaches are tremendously important for nesting terns, roseate terns, common terns, etc. So it's not just the development of the coasts of Long Island Sound that are going against our birds. They never had big environments to begin with. This is one of the few really large natural beaches in our area. This is the Bluff Point area. It's the natural beach you can walk out on. One of the largest sand areas. If you think about it, everything else is very, very much smaller than that, but critical to these beach nesting birds. So why don't we have more of them? Because we don't have much beach, not only because we built houses on top of the beaches, but because they were never very big to begin with because of the glaciers. So the offshore islands for things like common terns are absolutely critical. Great Gull, Faulkner Island, etc. It's funny when you walk out, Meg's Point's one of the most famous birding areas in Connecticut, and you walk out there and you can hear people. I once heard a guy sort of mansplaining to his girlfriend, wife, whatever, about how all this riprap was put in to protect the marsh. It's a natural moraine. These giant blocks are all that's left of lighter sediments have completely eroded away over 20,000 years of storms. And but this is entirely natural moraine. So I'm gonna hop through the last of this. But just to make a point, I tried to make a map when I was working on the Long Island Sound book of all the salt marshes in our region. And I ended up having to exaggerate a bit some of the sizes of the marshes, because when I drew them in at actual scale, you could hardly see anything. This is how little we have in the way of salt marshes. So Long Island Sound is a wonderful, productive estuary, but it will never be as productive, for example, as the Chesapeake, because we're not ringed by those giant salt marshes that are essentially a biological productivity engine for the Chesapeake and the original Delaware Bay, et cetera. But what we have is pretty nice. It's small. It's a more intimate scale than you see down south. I've spent a lot of time lately on the mid-Atlantic coast. And our marshes, albeit small, are really important for protection against the rising sea level and storms. So, and unfortunately, we're losing a lot of them. This is Wheeler Marsh that's just north of, this is Milford Point out here. The Connecticut Audubon Coastal Center is right here. They didn't have the observation tower back in the 70s, but I remember in the 70s and the 80s, lots of birders do, that this marsh was very much thicker and filled in than it was. It's drowning because of sea level rise. So, and the things that live in it, like salt marsh sparrows, are also drowning too. So we didn't have a lot of salt marsh, and we're beginning to lose what we have. Just one last thing. Another myth about Connecticut's and Long Island Sound's geography is that we have dirty beaches. People don't like to go to the beach because the waves are small and the sand looks dirty. Well, the sand's not dirty at all. It's brown and not the sort of sugar sand white that you see on the Outer Banks and stuff, because it's so young. A lot of this sand maybe as little as 4,000 or 5,000 years old, compared to millions of years of sand further south of us. And that's because, and this is a microscopic view that I took of a handful of sand from Lighthouse Point. It's brown because of all the different colors that are in it. All these bright, many of them semi-precious minerals like garnet and other things are very much softer than the feldspar and quartz that you see in very white sand. And those will eventually get ground away. And as our sand ages, it will become lighter. But right now, as you learn from grade school, mixing colors, if you mix all the colors together, you get brown. So with that, I think I'm going to bail out here because I don't want to run over on time. Our rocky shores may not be all that productive, but again, it's a different environment that draws in things that we might not have otherwise, like purple sandpipers, like harlequin ducks, etc. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
Well, thanks, Pat. Let's open it up for a few questions. You can raise your hand in the reactions, and I'll call on you. You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, don't forget to unmute or we won't hear you speaking. I think I bludgeoned them into submission.
I think it was so complete that there are no questions.
Well, anyway, we have very, very interesting geology. And I think it's important when you go out birding in the environment to have some sense of where things came from, not just the particular bird, the particular wildflower, but the story behind how the environment came to be is really interesting in itself, and geology is a big part of that. Oh, thanks, Jeff. Thanks for your note. Yeah, how much I packed in. Somebody said it's only 500 million years.
Please remind us of where the maps were from.
The maps in my presentation?
Yes.
Most of them I drew. Many of the diagrams I drew. Some of the fuzzier ones I just didn't have time to redraw for the presentation, but I love drawing maps.
And as I said before, I like looking at the maps you draw.
Somebody asked about where to volunteer for things. Save the Sound is very, very active and has lots of volunteer opportunities. Connecticut Audubon does. It's not hard to find opportunities, but you might start with, and National Audubon does a fair amount of stuff too in partnerships with some of the other organizations. So Save the Sound, Connecticut Audubon Society, National Audubon Society do things all the time, mostly in milder weather. Okay.
All right.
Well, there's no further questions.
Thanks, Pat.
Okay.
And
Thank
we'll
you.
see you in a few months with yet another talk.
Oh yeah, I'm going to talk about basically I'm going to talk about my backyard.
Yes. And then in January we have a talk by Ken Elkins from Audubon, Connecticut. And you can get more information about that from our website and register for that program. And also the 2nd of January is our Christmas bird count, which returns this year after a year off last winter for the pandemic. And there's information about that on the website as well. So thanks, Pat. Have a safe and wonderful holiday, everybody. Take care.
Okay. Happy holidays.